The war was over. 10 years of brutal conflict had laid the mighty city of Troy to waste. For the victorious Greeks, the journey home should have been a final, triumphant chapter. But for one man, the king of Ithaca, the war was just the beginning of his ordeal. This is the story of Odysseus, a hero celebrated for his cunning mind and unbreakable will. A man who, having toppled a city, found himself lost in a world of myth and magic, a pawn in the games of vengeful gods. For another 10 years, he would wander the unforgiving seas, facing down mythical beasts and enchanting sorceresses, driven by a single, burning desire: to return to his kingdom, his son, and the wife who waited for him. His name would become a legend, his journey an epic, the ultimate testament to human endurance against the whims of fate. The war was over. For 10 years, the greatest heroes of Greece had laid siege to the impenetrable walls of Troy. Now, those walls were breached, the city a smoldering ruin under a sky thick with smoke. Among the victorious commanders stood Odysseus, king of Ithaca, his mind as sharp as any sword in the Achaean army. It was his genius, his stratagem of the hollow wooden horse, that had finally delivered the city into their hands. He watched the flames consume the towers of King Priam, a grim satisfaction mixed with a profound weariness. The cost of this victory had been immense, paid with the lives of friends and comrades, with a decade stolen from his life, from his wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus, who was just an infant when he left. The Greek soldiers, drunk on victory and relief, ransacked the fallen city. They claimed treasures and took captives, their cheers echoing through the desolate streets. But in their haste and arrogance, they committed unforgivable offenses. Temples were desecrated, altars overturned. They showed little reverence for the gods who had granted them their triumph, a fatal oversight for mortals who depended on divine favor. Odysseus, though more cautious than most, was not immune to the pride that infected the army. He was the mastermind, the man who succeeded where brute force had failed for a decade. He believed his intellect made him the master of his own fate, a dangerous assumption in a world governed by the whims of Olympus. As the spoils were divided and the ships were loaded, a deep yearning for home settled over Odysseus. The image of Ithaca's rocky shores was a constant presence in his mind. He longed for the familiar comfort of his own hall, the embrace of his wife, the chance to finally know the son he had left behind. The other kings, Agamemnon, Menelaus, were also eager to return to their own kingdoms, to reclaim their lives and enjoy the spoils of their long campaign. They made their final preparations, offering hasty, inadequate sacrifices to the gods before pushing their black-hulled ships into the waters of the Aegean. With a fair wind at their backs, the vast fleet set sail. The coastline of Troy, scarred and burning, slowly faded into the horizon. A collective sigh of relief passed through the crews. The war was done. The journey home, they believed, would be a simple matter of navigating the familiar sea lanes back to Greece. Odysseus stood at the prow of his flagship, the salty spray on his face washing away the dust of Troy. He looked forward, toward home, convinced the hardest part of his journey was over. He could not feel the unseen eyes of the gods watching from above, their patience worn thin by mortal arrogance. The sea was calm, but it was a deceptive calm, a quiet breath before the storm of a god's fury was unleashed. The initial optimism of the voyage home was short-lived. The gods, angered by the Greeks' sacrilegious behavior in Troy, were not inclined to grant them a peaceful passage. Poseidon, the mighty earthshaker and ruler of the seas, was particularly incensed. His divine will, stirred by the hubris of the mortals, began to manifest in the very waters beneath their hulls. Without warning, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the sea began to churn with a supernatural violence. A great storm, born not of nature, but of divine wrath, fell upon the fleet. Mountainous waves crashed over the decks, splintering masts as if they were twigs, and scattering the ships across the vast, unforgiving sea. The fleet was shattered, each king left to find his own way home, if he could. Odysseus, through skill and sheer determination, managed to keep his own squadron of 12 ships together. But they were hopelessly lost, blown far off course into uncharted waters. After days of battling the tempest, they sighted land. It was the coast of the Ciconies, allies of Troy. Still operating with the mindset of conquerors, Odysseus and his men stormed the city of Ismarus. They plundered its wealth and subdued its people, a brutal continuation of the war they thought they had left behind. But this was not Troy. The Ciconies were not broken. They regrouped, summoning allies from the interior, and launched a fierce counterattack at dawn. Caught by surprise, the Greeks were driven back. The Ciconies, fighting for their homes, were relentless. A savage battle erupted on the beaches, and Odysseus's men, heavy with wine and plunder, were no match for the furious defenders. They were forced into a desperate retreat, scrambling for their ships as spears rained down upon them. For every ship, several men were lost, their triumphant cheers from Troy now replaced by the grim reality of a foolish and costly defeat. It was a humbling lesson. The world was not simply theirs for the taking. Every shore had its own people, its own strength. They escaped, but they were wounded in both body and spirit. Mourning their fallen comrades, they set sail once more, only to be met again by the relentless fury of Poseidon. For 9 more days, a punishing gale drove them south, past the familiar islands of Greece and into the unknown. The navigational charts were useless. The stars were obscured. They were no longer voyagers, but castaways at the mercy of a hostile god. The anger of Poseidon was a palpable force, a constant pressure that promised only more suffering. They had left the world of men and were being pushed inexorably into a world of myth, where the laws of nature were subject to the passions of the gods. Their true Odyssey had just begun. After the violence of the Ciconies and the fury of the sea, the ships and their crews were battered and broken. Hope was a dwindling resource. Then, through the haze, they saw it. An island, lush and green, with a shoreline that promised a peaceful harbor. It seemed a paradise, a respite sent by some compassionate deity. Exhausted and demoralized, Odysseus guided his small fleet to the shore, the men desperate for fresh water and a moment of peace on solid ground. The land was strangely quiet, the air sweet and tranquil. It was the land of the lotus eaters, a place where danger wore the mask of serenity. As a prudent commander, Odysseus sent a party of 3 men to explore, to find water and to learn what kind of people inhabited this gentle land. The men ventured inland and soon encountered the natives. The lotus eaters were not hostile or savage. They were a mild, welcoming people with a dreamlike quality about them. They greeted the Greek scouts warmly and, as a gesture of hospitality, offered them their most prized food, the honey-sweet fruit of the lotus plant. The weary sailors, suspecting no harm from such peaceful hosts, gratefully accepted the offering and ate. The effect was immediate and profound. It was not a poison that attacked the body, but a magic that soothed the mind. As the sweet fruit dissolved on their tongues, all their troubles dissolved with it. The memories of the brutal war, the terror of the storm, the grief for their lost friends, all faded into a pleasant haze. Most importantly, their longing for home, the driving ambition that had sustained them for a decade, vanished completely. They forgot about Ithaca, about their families, and about their duty to return. They desired nothing more than to stay on that island forever, to live in a state of blissful contentment, eating the lotus day after day. On the ship, Odysseus waited. Hours passed, and his scouts did not return. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. This was not the danger of a sword or a monster, but something more insidious. Taking a few more men, he went in search of his missing crew. He found them sitting among the lotus eaters, their faces vacant and smiling, their eyes seeing nothing of the world beyond their immediate, placid existence. When Odysseus called their names, they looked at him as if he were a stranger. When he spoke of Ithaca, they showed no recognition. They refused to leave, pleading to be left in their newfound paradise. Odysseus realized he could not reason with them. Their will had been stolen. In a moment of decisive leadership, he ordered his other men to seize the scouts. They dragged them, weeping and struggling, back to the ships. They did not fight back with anger, but with the sorrow of being torn from a perfect dream. Odysseus had them bound tightly to the rowing benches, ensuring they could not escape. He then gave the order for immediate departure, for every man to board and row with all their might, lest anyone else taste the fruit of forgetfulness. As they pulled away from that seductive shore, Odysseus knew he had saved his men from a living oblivion, but the allure of that easy peace was a ghost that would sail with them back into the harsh and unforgiving sea. Fleeing the hypnotic shores of the lotus eaters, Odysseus and his crew sailed onward, their encounter with temptation serving as a stark reminder of the strange new world they now inhabited. Soon, they came to another island, this one wild and fertile, populated by countless goats. It seemed a perfect place to replenish their dwindling supplies. Leaving the main part of his fleet in a safe harbor, Odysseus took his own ship and a dozen of his best men to explore. As a gesture of peace, he carried a goatskin of exceptionally strong, unmixed wine, a gift worthy of a king. They discovered a cave of immense proportions, clearly the dwelling of a being far greater than any man. Inside, the signs of a rustic life were everywhere: pens of lambs, baskets overflowing with cheese, and buckets of milk. The sheer scale of it all was astonishing. Odysseus's men, driven by hunger and curiosity, urged him to take some cheese and lambs and leave quickly. But Odysseus, guided by a fatal mix of curiosity and adherence to custom, refused. He wanted to meet the owner of this cave, expecting to receive a gift in accordance with the sacred laws of hospitality that governed the civilized world. This assumption would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The ground began to tremble. The inhabitant of the cave was returning. It was a Cyclops, a monstrous, one-eyed giant named Polyphemus. He drove his flock into the cave and then rolled a stone over the entrance so massive that 24 wagons could not move it. They were trapped. When the Cyclops finally saw the intruders, his reaction was not one of hospitality, but of contempt. Odysseus pleaded their case, invoking the name of Zeus, the protector of guests. The giant laughed, proclaiming that the Cyclopes cared nothing for the gods. His response was swift and brutal. He seized 2 of Odysseus's men, and their fate was sealed in an instant. The horrifying display left the others paralyzed with fear. They were trapped in a lair with a creature that saw them only as food. Odysseus's mind, his greatest weapon, worked furiously. Direct confrontation was impossible. He needed a plan. The next day, after the giant had consumed 2 more men, Odysseus put his scheme into motion. He offered the Cyclops the potent wine. Polyphemus, who had never tasted anything so fine, drank it greedily and asked for Odysseus's name. The cunning king replied, "My name is Nobody." Soon, the giant collapsed into a drunken stupor. This was their chance. Odysseus and his men had found a massive olive wood club in the cave, and they had sharpened its point, hardening it in the embers of the fire. Now, with all their combined strength, they lifted the stake and drove the heated point into the giant's single eye, extinguishing his sight in a single, decisive act. Polyphemus awoke with a deafening roar of pain, clawing at his ruined eye. He cried out to the other Cyclopes on the island for help, When they called back, asking who was harming him, he could only scream, "Nobody is hurting me!" Hearing this, his brethren dismissed his cries as a fit of madness and left him to his fate. The trick had worked, but the blind, enraged giant now sat blocking the cave's entrance, and their escape was far from certain. The escape from the Cyclops' cave was as ingenious as the blinding itself. Odysseus lashed his men to the bellies of the giant's thick-fleeced rams. As the blind Polyphemus led his flock out to pasture, he ran his hands over their backs, never detecting the men hidden beneath. They had survived. But as they sailed away from the cursed island, Odysseus's pride overwhelmed his caution. He could not resist the urge to taunt the wounded giant, shouting insults from his ship. Enraged, Polyphemus hurled massive boulders that nearly sank them. Still not satisfied, Odysseus committed his greatest folly. He yelled his true name, his lineage, and his homeland across the water. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, from Ithaca." This single act of hubris sealed his fate. Polyphemus, now knowing his attacker's name, raised his arms to the sky and prayed to his father, Poseidon. He cursed Odysseus to wander the seas for many years, to lose all his companions, and if he were ever to return home, to find his house in a state of chaos. The god of the sea heard his son's prayer, and a terrible binding curse was set in motion. The full weight of an Olympian's wrath was now focused on one mortal man. Yet, for a brief moment, it seemed fortune might smile on them again. They arrived at the floating island of Aeolia, the home of Aeolus, whom the gods had appointed as the keeper of the winds. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus and his crew, and for a full month they feasted in his halls, while Odysseus recounted the epic tale of the Trojan War. Charmed by his guest, Aeolus offered a parting gift of astonishing power. He captured all the storm winds, the north, the south, and the east, and bound them securely in a bag of oxhide. He left only the gentle west wind free to blow Odysseus's ship swiftly and directly back to Ithaca. With this magical assistance, the journey was incredibly fast. For 9 days and nights, Odysseus himself steered the ship, never sleeping, his eyes fixed on the horizon. On the 10th day, his homeland appeared. He could see the rocky shores of Ithaca, even the smoke rising from the chimneys of the homes. He was there. Victory was in his grasp. Utterly exhausted, believing the danger was past, Odysseus finally allowed himself to fall asleep. While he slept, his crew's suspicion festered. They eyed the heavy bag Aeolus had given him, whispering that it must be filled with gold and silver that Odysseus planned to keep for himself. Overcome by greed and jealousy, they decided to open it. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. All the violent winds burst forth at once, creating a tempest of unimaginable force that spun the ships around and blasted them back across the sea, away from their home. Odysseus awoke to the screams of his men and the sight of Ithaca's shores vanishing in the distance. His hope, so close to being realized, was utterly shattered by the foolishness of his own crew. After the blinding of the Cyclops, a bitter wind from the vengeful sea god Poseidon blew Odysseus and his fleet far off course. For 6 days and nights, they were tormented by storms, finally sighting land on the 7th day. They found a spectacular natural harbor, a perfect circle of water surrounded by sheer, towering cliffs, with only a narrow channel leading to the open sea. Believing it a safe haven, 11 of the 12 ships in the fleet eagerly sailed inside, mooring themselves close together in the calm, protected waters. Only Odysseus, guided by a flicker of intuition or deep-seated caution, kept his own vessel outside the entrance, securing it to a rock on the coast. The land seemed peaceful, but it was a deceptive tranquility. Odysseus sent 3 of his men as scouts to learn about the inhabitants. They followed a track inland and soon encountered a young woman of astonishing size who identified herself as the daughter of Antiphates, king of this land. She guided them toward her father's citadel, but any hope of a warm welcome was instantly shattered. The king and his people were the Laestrygonians, a race of powerful, man-eating giants. Without a word of greeting, Antiphates seized one of the scouts, a man named Polites, and prepared him for his evening meal. The other two men fled in terror, racing back to the harbor with the horrifying news. But it was too late. The alarm was raised throughout the giants' city. They swarmed to the cliffs overlooking the harbor, not with spears or swords, but with immense boulders they ripped from the mountainside. From their high vantage point, they began to rain destruction down upon the trapped fleet. The sound was cataclysmic, the splintering of timber, the shattering of masts, and the cries of men who had nowhere to run. The harbor became a scene of total devastation as the giants systematically destroyed the ships and speared the sailors in the water like fish. From his position outside the cove, Odysseus could only watch in horror. Realizing his men were lost, he made a swift, agonizing decision. He drew his sword, slashed the mooring cables of his own ship, and screamed at his crew to row for their lives. His was the only ship to escape the carnage. As they pulled frantically for the open sea, they looked back at the harbor filled with the wreckage of their fleet and the floating debris of their former lives. In a single, brutal afternoon, Odysseus had lost 11 ships and hundreds of his loyal companions. The grief was overwhelming, a crushing weight of failure and loss that would haunt him for the rest of his journey. Battered by grief and reduced to a single ship, Odysseus and his surviving crew sailed on, their spirits at their lowest ebb. They eventually landed on the shores of Aiaia, an island that seemed almost unnaturally lush and quiet. For 2 days they rested, overwhelmed by exhaustion and sorrow. On the 3rd day, Odysseus took his spear and sword and climbed a high point to survey the land. He saw smoke rising from a clearing deep within the dense forest, a sign of habitation that brought both hope and trepidation. He returned and divided his men into 2 parties. He would remain with one group at the ship, while his trusted kinsman, Eurylochus, would lead the other to investigate the source of the smoke. Eurylochus and his 22 men ventured into the woods, soon discovering a grand palace built of polished stone. The clearing around it was filled with wild beasts, mountain lions and wolves, that behaved with an eerie docility. Instead of attacking, they rose on their hind legs and fawned on the men like household pets. From within the palace, the men heard a beautiful, captivating voice singing. It was the voice of the enchantress Circe. She appeared at the shining doors and beckoned them inside. All the men, charmed by her beauty and grace, followed her in, all except the cautious Eurylochus, who sensed a trap and remained hidden. Circe seated her guests on fine chairs and served them a mixture of cheese, barley, honey, and strong wine. But mingled with the feast was a malevolent potion. Once they had eaten and drunk, she struck them with her wand. Instantly, their bodies changed. They were transformed into swine, with the heads, voices, and bristles of pigs, yet they retained their human minds, fully aware of their grotesque fate. She drove them into pens and threw them acorns and berries to eat. Eurylochus, having witnessed this from his hiding place, ran back to the ship in a panic, urging Odysseus to flee immediately. But Odysseus refused to abandon his men. Grabbing his sword, he set off for the palace alone. On his way, he was intercepted by the messenger god, Hermes, who gave him a sacred herb called moly, a plant with a black root and a white flower, which would make him immune to Circe's magic. Forewarned and protected, Odysseus confronted the enchantress. She offered him the same enchanted drink, but it had no effect. As she raised her wand to strike him, he drew his sword and lunged, holding the blade to her throat. Terrified and astonished that a mortal could resist her power, Circe surrendered. She swore a sacred oath not to harm him and, at his demand, restored his men to their human forms. They were not only men again, but taller, younger, and more handsome than before. So began a strange interlude, as Odysseus and his crew remained on Aiaia for a full year, healing and feasting as guests of the enchantress who had so nearly been their doom. But the allure of home was stronger than any magic, and the time would soon come for them to leave. Circe, however, had one final terrifying condition for their departure: a journey to a place from which few had ever returned. The year of comfort and recovery on Aiaia came to an end with a chilling revelation from Circe. To find the way back to Ithaca, Odysseus could not rely on maps or stars alone. He had to undertake a journey beyond the limits of the known world, to the dark realm of Hades, the land of the departed. There, he was to seek the counsel of the blind prophet Tiresias, the only spirit who retained his wisdom and foresight. The news struck the crew with terror. A voyage to the underworld was a journey into the heart of fear itself, a destination for the deceased, not the living. But Odysseus's resolve was firm. Following Circe's detailed instructions, they sailed to the river Oceanus, which encircles the world, reaching the fog-shrouded land of the Cimmerians, a place the sun never penetrates. They beached their ship and proceeded on foot to the spot Circe had described, the confluence of the rivers of fire and tears. There, Odysseus dug a trench and performed the solemn rites. He poured libations to all the departed, milk, honey, wine, and water, and sprinkled white barley. He then made a sacrifice, and as the offering was made, the spirits of the departed began to gather like shadows from the gloom, drawn by the scent. Odysseus, his sword drawn, stood guard over the trench, holding back the swarming, insubstantial figures. He had to prevent any spirit from partaking until he had spoken with Tiresias. The first spirit to approach was that of Elpenor, a young crewman who had accidentally fallen from Circe's roof before their departure. He pleaded with Odysseus to return to Aiaia and give his body a proper burial so his spirit could find rest. Odysseus promised he would. Then a figure emerged that broke his heart. It was the shade of his mother, Anticlea. He had left her alive and well in Ithaca. He had no idea she had passed. Overcome with emotion, he tried to embrace her, but his arms passed through her spectral form 3 times. She explained that this is what becomes of all mortals, their physical forms consumed, leaving only the spirit. Her presence was a painful testament to the immense length of his absence and the personal toll it had taken on his family. Finally, the shade of Tiresias of Thebes appeared, carrying a golden scepter. After partaking of the offering, the blind prophet delivered his crucial, ominous prophecy. The way home would be fraught with peril, a test of discipline and restraint for him and his entire crew. With the words of Tiresias echoing in his mind, Odysseus left the land of the Cimmerians, his spirit heavy with the burden of prophecy. The voyage back from the edge of the world was somber, each man lost in his own thoughts about the spectral figures they had witnessed. Their first duty was to honor their fallen comrade. They returned to the island of Aiaia, where they performed the funeral rites for Elpenor, building a pyre and marking his resting place with an oar. Circe welcomed them back, not with spells, but with sustenance and vital counsel. She knew the path they had to take and the trials foretold by Tiresias. In the quiet of her palace, she sat with Odysseus and laid out the gauntlet that awaited him, transforming the prophet's vague warnings into a concrete and terrifying itinerary of survival. She explained that he would first have to navigate past the island of the Sirens, creatures whose irresistible song lured sailors to their doom upon the rocky shores. Her advice was precise and ingenious. Odysseus should plug his crew's ears with soft beeswax so they would be deaf to the enchanting melody. But for Odysseus himself, a man whose defining trait was his curiosity and thirst for knowledge, she offered a way to hear the song and live. He was to have his men bind him securely to the ship's mast and swear an oath not to release him, no matter how much he might beg. After the sirens, Circe outlined an even more dire choice. He would have to choose between two routes, each with its own formidable peril. One was the prowling rocks, a passage of such violent churning waters that not even birds could fly through it safely. The other route would take him through a narrow strait flanked by two monstrous hazards. On one side was Scylla, a creature with 6 heads who would snatch sailors from the deck. On the other was Charybdis, a terrifying whirlpool that could swallow a ship whole. Circe advised him to sail closer to Scylla, arguing it was better to lose 6 men than to lose the entire ship and all hands to Charybdis. But the most critical warning, the one that Tiresias had stressed above all others, concerned the island of Thrinacia. There, the sacred cattle of the sun god, Helios, grazed peacefully. Circe reiterated the prophet's words with grave intensity. The crew must not, under any circumstances, harm these animals. If they sailed past without touching the herds, they might all see Ithaca again. But if they gave in to temptation and harmed the cattle, the prophecy was absolute: destruction for the ship and the entire crew. Only Odysseus might survive, and if he did, he would return home late, broken, and alone. Armed with this dreadful knowledge, Odysseus prepared to set sail once more. He was now not just a captain, but the sole guardian of a future he could not fully share with his men, lest their morale shatter completely. The first test was now just over the horizon. As Odysseus's ship approached the coordinates Circe had provided, a strange and unnatural stillness fell upon the sea. The wind vanished, the waves flattened into a glassy calm, and the ship lost all momentum. The crew, sensing a divine influence, furled the sail as Odysseus prepared them for the ordeal ahead. He did not tell them the full truth of the horrors to come, but he explained the immediate danger of the sirens. He took a large disc of beeswax and, with his strong hands, worked it until it was pliable. He then walked among his men, carefully pressing a piece into the ears of each sailor until they were completely sealed from the world of sound. Next, he had them take up their positions at the oars and instructed them to bind him to the great mast at the center of the ship. They wound the ropes around his torso, his arms, and his legs, pulling the knots tight until he was completely immobilized. His final, stern command was that they were to ignore any signal, plea, or order he might give. If he struggled, they were to add more ropes and bind him even tighter. The men nodded their understanding and began to row, their powerful strokes propelling the silent ship toward a flowery meadow on a nearby island. As they drew closer, the legendary song of the sirens began to drift across the water. It was a sound of otherworldly beauty, a melody so pure and clear it promised to end all suffering. But it was more than just music. It was a psychic assault, tailored to its listener. The sirens sang directly to Odysseus, calling him by name, lauding his heroic deeds at Troy, and promising him the ultimate prize for a man of his intellect, omniscience. They sang of the past and the future, offering to reveal all the secrets of the world. For Odysseus, the temptation was an agony beyond physical pain. The song bypassed his reason and struck at the core of his ambition and pride. An overwhelming, desperate need to join the sirens consumed him. He strained against his bonds, his muscles bulging. He shouted commands, his voice unheard by his deafened crew. He gestured frantically with his head and eyebrows, begging them to set him free. His loyal men, however, obeyed his original orders. Two of them, Perimedes and Eurylochus, rose from their benches, not to release him, but to add more ropes, pulling his bonds even tighter against the mast. The crew rowed with all their might, their faces grim with effort, their eyes fixed forward, never once glancing at their tormented captain or the beautiful, treacherous island. Slowly, agonizingly, the ship moved past the shore, which was littered with the whitened bones of countless sailors who had succumbed to that same song. As the ship cleared the island, the melody began to fade. The compulsion gripping Odysseus vanished as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving him gasping and drenched in sweat. His mind cleared, and he signaled to his men. They released him from his bonds and removed the wax from their ears. They had passed the first test. But as the unnatural calm lifted, they heard a new sound up ahead. The deep, thunderous roar of churning water. Their relief was fleeting, for before them lay the impossible choice between two new, monstrous perils. The last enchanting note of the siren's song has faded, but the silence that follows is not one of peace. It is the heavy, anxious quiet before an inevitable catastrophe. Before Odysseus and his crew lies the most perilous strait of their journey, a passage where ruin waits on either side. On one flank looms a sheer, menacing cliff, home to the creature Scylla. On the other, the sea itself opens into a monstrous maw, the whirlpool Charybdis, which inhales and expels the ocean 3 times a day. There is no safe path. There is only a choice of how to face destruction. The witch Circe's warning was clear: sail closer to Scylla. Charybdis would mean the end of them all, the ship and every man aboard swallowed into the depths. Scylla, she had promised, would only take 6. It is a horrifying calculation, a leader's ultimate nightmare. Odysseus must knowingly sacrifice part of his crew to save the rest. He keeps this grim detail to himself, understanding that his men, paralyzed by fear, would refuse to row. He dons his armor, a futile gesture against a foe he cannot fight, and stands at the prow, his heart heavy with the price of their passage. As they steer clear of the churning vortex, the men stare, mesmerized by the terrifying spectacle of Charybdis. This is the distraction Scylla needs. From the dark caves above, 6 long serpentine necks lash out with blinding speed. The attack is too swift to counter. 6 of his strongest men are lifted from the deck, their desperate cries echoing against the rock face. Odysseus can only watch, helpless, as they are taken to the monster's lair. He would later call it the most pitiful thing his eyes had ever seen on all his travels. The surviving crew rose with frantic energy, their minds seared by the sounds and the sight of their companion's fate. They have passed through the strait, but the cost is etched onto the soul of every survivor. The ship, now lighter by 6, feels emptier, haunted by the ghosts of the men they were forced to leave behind. They have escaped one trap, only to sail on, broken and diminished, toward the next temptation on the horizon. Grief-stricken and exhausted, the mariners guide their battered ship toward a lush, green island. It is Thrinacia, the land of the sun god, Helios. It appears as a paradise, a respite from the horrors of the sea. But Odysseus knows better. He carries a grave warning from both the prophet Tiresias and the sorceress Circe. Under no circumstances are they to harm the sacred herds of the sun. He gathers his weary men and makes them swear a solemn oath to leave the immortal cattle and sheep untouched. For a month, their journey is halted. Unfavorable winds, sent by a resentful deity, trap them on the island. The ship's provisions, meant for a swift journey, dwindle and then disappear. The men are reduced to fishing and hunting birds, a meager subsistence that barely keeps starvation at bay. Hunger gnaws at them, eroding their discipline and their fear of divine law. One day, while Odysseus has retreated inland to pray for deliverance, his second-in-command, Eurylochus, rallies the starving crew. He presents a compelling, desperate argument. To perish from hunger is the most ignoble end for a warrior. Is it not better to make a sacrifice of the finest cattle, to feast and regain their strength, and deal with the gods' anger later? His words find fertile ground in their empty stomachs. The oath is broken. The crew rounds up the best of Helios's cattle. As Odysseus returns, the scent of roasting meat alerts him to the terrible transgression. He is aghast, but the deed is done. The gods immediately show their displeasure through chilling omens. The skins of the offered animals begin to move, and the meat on the spits makes sounds as if it were still alive. Far away, Helios, learning of the sacrilege, appeals to Zeus for justice, demanding a terrible price for his loss. When the winds finally shift, the men eagerly set sail, their bellies full, but their fates sealed. Once they are out of sight of land, the sky darkens. Zeus unleashes his promised retribution. A furious squall descends, and a bolt of lightning shatters the mast, striking the helmsman. The ship is torn apart by the waves, and every man who partook in the forbidden feast is cast into the churning sea. Only Odysseus, who did not eat, survives, clinging to the wreckage of his ship and his command. After the fury of Zeus's storm, Odysseus is once more a solitary survivor on an unforgiving sea. For 9 days he drifts, clinging to the remnants of his vessel, until the currents wash him ashore on an island disconnected from the world of mortals. This is Ogygia, the navel of the sea, and the home of the beautiful nymph, Calypso. She is a daughter of the Titan Atlas, a goddess of stunning beauty and immense power, and she is instantly captivated by the mortal hero who has washed up on her shore. She takes him in, nurses him back to health, and offers him a life of ease and luxury. Her island is a paradise of lush forests, fragrant flowers, and crystal-clear springs. She offers him fine food, enchanting songs, and her own divine companionship. More than that, she offers him the one thing no other mortal can obtain: immortality. She promises to make him a god, to live with her forever, ageless and free from all worldly suffering. Yet, for Odysseus, this paradise is a prison. The offer of godhood is a temptation he must refuse. His heart belongs not to a goddess, but to a mortal woman, his wife, Penelope. His soul yearns not for an eternity of ease, but for his rocky homeland of Ithaca and his son, Telemachus, who is growing into a man without him. For 7 long years, he remains Calypso's captive. By day, he is the companion of a goddess, sharing her table and her cavern home. But when evening comes, he walks to the shore and sits upon the rocks, staring out at the empty expanse of the wine-dark sea. He weeps not for his lost men or his past hardships, but for the future he is being denied. His fame, his kingdom, his very identity are fading with each passing year. Calypso's love, though genuine, is a gilded cage, and the hero's spirit is withering within it. He is safe from monsters and storms, but he is in peril of losing the one thing that defines him, his humanity and his unyielding quest for home. While the king of Ithaca remains stranded in a timeless paradise, his fate becomes a matter of celestial debate. The stage for the next act of his Odyssey is not on earth or sea, but in the gleaming cloud-wreathed halls of Mount Olympus. Here, the immortal gods have gathered in council, their divine wills shaping the destinies of the mortals below. It is Athena, the goddess of wisdom and Odysseus's staunchest ally, who brings his case before the assembly. With impassioned eloquence, she addresses her father, Zeus, the king of the gods. She speaks of Odysseus's cleverness, his courage, and his unwavering piety throughout the long Trojan War and his even longer journey home. She paints a vivid picture of his suffering, a hero held against his will by a possessive nymph, while back in Ithaca, his wife is besieged by arrogant suitors who devour his estate and plot against his son. How can the gods, she argues, allow such a worthy man to be so utterly forgotten and his family to be so tormented? Zeus, ruler of the cosmos, listens with a thoughtful expression. He concedes that Odysseus is a man of great merit and that his ordeal has been excessive. He clarifies that his own hand has not been against the hero. The true obstacle, he explains, has been the unrelenting anger of his brother, Poseidon, god of the seas. The sea god has never forgiven Odysseus for blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and has used his power to thwart the hero's return at every turn. But now, a window of opportunity has opened. Poseidon is temporarily absent, having traveled to the distant land of the Ethiopians to receive a grand sacrifice. In his absence, Zeus can act. Moved by Athena's plea and his own sense of justice, he makes a decision. The hero's exile will end. He summons Hermes, the swift-footed messenger of the gods, and gives him an unequivocal command. Hermes is to fly to the island of Ogygia and deliver a message directly to the nymph Calypso. The decree is absolute. She must release Odysseus and aid him in his departure. The gears of fate, long stalled, begin to turn once more, set in motion by a divine judgment that will change everything for the lost king. Riding a golden breeze, the messenger god Hermes arrives on Ogygia, delivering the unassailable command of Zeus. For Calypso, the news is devastating. She protests, accusing the male gods of hypocrisy for denying her a mortal companion. But she knows she cannot defy the king of Olympus. With a heavy heart, she finds Odysseus on the shore and tells him the news he has awaited for 7 years. He is free to go home. The hero, whose life has been a series of divine tricks and trials, is immediately suspicious. He makes the goddess swear a binding oath that she is not plotting some new misfortune for him. True to her word, Calypso becomes his benefactor. She provides him with a great bronze axe and other tools, guiding him to a grove of sturdy trees. For 4 days, Odysseus works with the skill of a master shipwright, felling timbers and crafting a wide, stable raft, complete with a mast and sail. Calypso provisions it with water, wine, and food, and on the 5th day, she conjures a gentle, favorable wind to speed him on his way. For 17 days, Odysseus sails across the open sea, navigating by the stars as Calypso had instructed. Hope swells in his chest as he finally spots the shadowy mountains of a distant land. But his journey is being watched. Poseidon, returning from his travels, spots the raft of his old enemy. The sea god's fury erupts in a cataclysmic storm. He summons winds from every direction, piling up waves that tower like mountains. The raft is tossed about mercilessly until a colossal wave shatters its mast. Odysseus is thrown into the violent, churning water. Weighed down by the fine clothes Calypso gave him, he struggles for air, tangled in the sail and rigging. He manages to climb back aboard the broken timbers, but the raft is now just a collection of logs at the mercy of the tempest. As he faces his end, help arrives from an unexpected quarter. The sea nymph Ino rises from the waves. Taking pity on him, she gives him her immortal veil, telling him to tie it around his waist. It will protect him, she promises, but he must cast it back into the sea without looking once he reaches land. Trusting her, he abandons the wreckage and commits himself to the waves. For 2 days and 2 nights, he is battered by the sea until, finally, the storm subsides. Exhausted and near his final limit, he washes ashore on the coast of Scheria, a shipwrecked king on an unknown land. After 20 years of wandering, the shores of Ithaca finally rise from the sea to greet Odysseus. Yet, this is no triumphant homecoming for a celebrated king. Guided by his divine protector, the goddess Athena, he is transformed, his heroic physique cloaked in the guise of a frail, elderly beggar. His own land is now a foreign country, his palace a nest of vipers. To return as a king would be to walk into an ambush. To return as a forgotten man, however, is to hold the element of surprise. His first destination is not the grand palace, but a humble, remote dwelling, the hut of Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd. Eumaeus represents the old Ithaca, the fading world of loyalty and honor that Odysseus fought to preserve. Unaware of the true identity of the stranger at his door, the swineherd offers him food, shelter, and kindness, lamenting the long absence of his beloved master. Listening to Eumaeus speak of him with such devotion, Odysseus feels the first stirrings of hope. Here, in this simple man, the spirit of his kingdom endures. While Odysseus takes measure of his homeland through the eyes of its most faithful servant, Athena sets the second part of her plan in motion. She travels to Sparta, where Odysseus's son, Telemachus, has been searching for news of his father. She urges the young prince to return home at once, warning him of the suitor's plot to ambush him on his journey. She directs him not to the palace, but to the very same swineherd's hut where his father is waiting. The threads of fate, so long frayed and scattered, are beginning to be woven together again. Odysseus, the master strategist, remains patient. He listens to Eumaeus's stories of the suitor's arrogance, their feasting and squandering of his estate, and their relentless pressure on his wife, Penelope. He learns of their contempt for the gods and for the laws of hospitality. Each word stokes the fire of his resolve. He is no longer just a wanderer seeking home. He is a king gathering intelligence, a predator observing his prey. The sun sets on Ithaca, casting long shadows over the island. A sun sails toward its shores, filled with a new sense of purpose. A father, hidden in plain sight, prepares for the most dangerous phase of his journey. The quiet of the countryside is deceptive. It is the calm before a great storm that will cleanse the kingdom or destroy it completely. In the quiet solitude of the swineherd's hut, two generations are about to collide. Telemachus, following the goddess's instructions, arrives at the secluded dwelling. The reunion between the young prince and the loyal Eumaeus is one of profound affection, like a father welcoming back a long-lost son. Odysseus watches them, his heart aching with a father's pride and sorrow for the years he has missed. He remains in his beggar's disguise, a silent observer to the conversation about the kingdom's plight. But the time for concealment is nearing its end. The goddess Athena appears, visible only to Odysseus. She nods, signaling that the moment has come. With a wave of her golden wand, the magic of the disguise dissolves. The stooped, wrinkled beggar vanishes, and in his place stands Odysseus, tall and majestic, his form radiating the divine favor of the gods. He is no longer a stranger, but a king in his prime. Telemachus is struck with awe and disbelief. He shields his eyes, convinced he is witnessing a divine being. He has spent his life dreaming of his father, but the reality is more overwhelming than any fantasy. He suspects a trick, a cruel illusion sent by the gods to mock his grief. It is then that Odysseus speaks, his voice thick with 20 years of unshed emotion. "I am not a god," he says. "I am your father, for whom you have waited and suffered, and whose return you have longed for." The words break through Telemachus's doubt. Tears stream down his face as he lunges forward, and for the first time, a father and son embrace. It is a moment of pure, undiluted joy, a release of 2 decades of longing and uncertainty. But their reunion is brief, for their purpose is deadly serious. The emotion of the moment quickly gives way to the cold logic of strategy. They sit together, the great warrior and his determined heir, and begin to plot. How many suitors are there? Who in the palace remains loyal? What weapons can they secure? Odysseus outlines his daring plan. He will resume his disguise and enter the palace, while Telemachus will hide the suitors' weapons. They will face over 100 arrogant, battle-ready men, with only a handful of allies. The odds are impossible, but for the first time, they face them together. A secret alliance is forged, sealed by blood, and a shared destiny. A father and son, united in purpose, prepare to walk into the heart of the enemy's camp, their quest for vengeance about to begin. The great hall of Ithaca's palace, once a symbol of order and prosperity, now echoes with the boisterous arrogance of unwelcome guests. And into this chaos walks a king, disguised as the lowest of the low. Accompanied by the swineherd, Odysseus, once again cloaked in the rags of a beggar, steps across the threshold of his own home for the first time in 20 years. The first to recognize him is not a human, but his old hunting dog, Argos. Lying neglected on a dung heap, the ancient hound lifts his head, recognizes his master's scent, and thumps his tail one last time before his long wait is finally over. It is a heartbreaking welcome, a silent testament to unwavering loyalty and the tragic passage of time. Inside the hall, Odysseus begins his reconnaissance. He moves among the suitors, begging for scraps from their lavish feast. This is not just a plea for food, it is a test of character. He observes their dispositions, separating the merely arrogant from the truly malevolent. Most toss him a piece of bread out of pity or sport, but their leader, the cruel and haughty Antinous, responds with pure contempt. He berates the beggar, scorning his presence in the hall of nobles. When Odysseus calmly rebukes him for his lack of charity, Antinous' rage erupts. He lifts a heavy wooden stool and hurls it, striking Odysseus squarely in the back. The king staggers, but does not fall, absorbing the blow with the endurance of a man who has weathered storms and faced monsters. He does not retaliate. He simply stands, his mind a cold calculus of fury and patience, marking Antinous as the first who will pay the price. This public act of disrespect does not go unnoticed. Even some of the other suitors are appalled by this violation of the sacred laws of hospitality, warning that the stranger could be a god in disguise. From her chambers above, Queen Penelope hears the commotion. Intrigued by the story of the beggar who endured Antinous' assault with such dignity, she summons him for a private audience, hoping he might carry news of her long-lost husband. The plan is working. Odysseus has gained the attention of his enemies and an invitation from his wife. He is now inside their circle, a hidden threat they casually dismiss. The queen has summoned the beggar. In the heart of his own home, Odysseus prepares to face his wife, a stranger to her eyes, but a husband in his soul. Every word will be a test, every glance a risk, as he walks a razor's edge between discovery and revenge. An air of finality settles over the palace. Driven by a sudden divine inspiration, Queen Penelope descends the grand staircase. In her hands, she carries a symbol of her husband's unmatched power and the key to her own future, the great bow of Odysseus. Her patience exhausted, she announces her decision to the suitors. The time for games is over. She will marry the man who can perform a feat only her husband could, string the great bow, and shoot an arrow clean through the sockets of 12 axe heads lined in a row. The suitors roar with approval, their arrogance blinding them to the impossibility of the task. They see only the prize, the queen and the kingdom, and believe it is finally within their grasp. One by one, they try. The strongest among them strain and sweat, their faces turning red with effort, but they cannot even bend the stiff, unyielding weapon. The bow, which was like an extension of Odysseus's own body, refuses to yield to these lesser men. Their initial confidence curdles into frustration, and then humiliation. Even Telemachus makes an attempt. To everyone's surprise, he nearly succeeds, demonstrating that he is indeed his father's son. But as he is about to make a final effort, he catches a subtle signal from the disguised Odysseus and steps aside, understanding that this moment belongs to his father. Amid the suitor's failures and complaints, the beggar speaks up, humbly requesting a chance to try his hand. The hall erupts in scornful laughter. Antinous, the cruelest of them all, furiously objects to the perceived insult of a vagrant competing for the queen's hand. But Penelope, intrigued by the beggar's quiet confidence, insists he be allowed to try. Telemachus, asserting his authority as master of the house, firmly seconds the command and sends his mother to her chambers, away from the impending confrontation. The bow is placed in Odysseus's hands. He handles it with the loving familiarity of a musician greeting an old instrument. The suitors watch, their mockery slowly turning to unease. Effortlessly, as if it were second nature, he braces the bow and strings it. The string sings with a sharp, clear note. A stunned silence falls over the great hall, broken only by a clap of thunder from Zeus, a divine omen of approval. The beggar then nocks an arrow, takes aim, and lets it fly. It streaks through the air, a perfect shot, passing cleanly through all 12 axes. The contest is over. The beggar sheds his rags, his true, formidable form revealed. "Now for another target," he declares, aiming his next arrow at the unsuspecting Antinous. The hunt has begun. The great hall, once a place of feasting, has been consecrated by righteous fury. The echoes of conflict fade, replaced by the profound silence of a kingdom reclaimed. With the help of his son, Telemachus, and his 2 loyal servants, Odysseus purged his home of the corruption that had plagued it for years. The suitors, who had disrespected the gods and devoured his estate, paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. The physical battle is won, but for Odysseus, the final and most important trial is yet to be won, the battle for his wife's heart. When the old nurse Eurycleia rushes to Penelope with the joyful news that Odysseus has returned and vanquished their enemies, the queen reacts not with immediate elation, but with guarded disbelief. 20 years of false hopes and cunning tricks have made her cautious. She descends to the hall and sees the man who claims to be her husband, but she remains distant, testing him from afar. She is wary of a deception from the gods. This is not the easy reunion of a fairy tale, but a meeting of 2 intelligent, cautious souls who have endured immense hardship. To confirm his identity beyond any doubt, Penelope devises a clever test. She casually instructs a servant to move the master bed out of their royal bedchamber for the guest to sleep on. This command provokes the exact reaction she was hoping for. Odysseus is immediately agitated, even offended. He asks how anyone could possibly move their bed, for he himself had built it. He describes in vivid detail how he constructed it from the trunk of a massive, living olive tree that grew in the center of their chamber, building the room around this immovable, deeply symbolic piece of furniture. This was their secret, a fact known only to the 2 of them. It is the undeniable proof of his identity. Penelope's caution finally melts away, and she runs to him, tears streaming down her face. Their embrace is the true culmination of the Odyssey, a reunion not just of a king and queen, but of a husband and wife whose bond has withstood time, distance, and temptation. Yet, one final challenge remains. The wealthy families of the slain suitors gather, armed and seeking vengeance. A new conflict threatens to engulf Ithaca, but the gods will not allow the hero's homecoming to be marred by more strife. Athena, disguised as the wise old mentor, intervenes directly. With her divine voice, she quells the rising anger, commands the people to live in peace, and formally restores Odysseus as the rightful, respected king of Ithaca. Peace settles over the land. The wanderer is home, the king is on his throne, and the family is whole. The 20-year Odyssey has reached its end, not merely with a return to a place, but with the complete restoration of a man's identity, his family, and his kingdom. The legend is complete.